Right, so I guess first I should mention that the NunatuKavut Community Council is the representative organization that represents the Indigenous rights of approximately 6,000 Southern Inuit in Labrador, in central and southeastern Labrador. And the name of our education program is the Southern Inuit Education Program, and it's currently being offered in 7 schools throughout our territory, from Cartwright to Mary's Harbour. So last year was the first year that we piloted the program, actually, and we've been very flexible with the age groups that schools and communities wish to target. Ideally, we're targeting junior high and high school populations, but our schools are often very small, and they're all K-12 schools, so there's lots of room and flexibility to gather students from K. Some schools that are K-12 might have 15-20 people in them. Some schools might have 80 or 90. So there's always lots of opportunity to get kids together and to get youth together in exchange of knowledge. And we do work with the schools to ensure that aspects of the education program are reflected in the younger grades as well. The program is really important. I think some background information is really important here to really speak to the place and role of this program. For many generations, it's been outsiders, whether that be outside academics or researchers or explorers or what have you, have come up on our lands and into our communities and have embraced a particular narrative about our people that has generally been written and understood from outside cultural biases. So from primarily, in our case, from the European male perspective. The implication of this has been such that stories that accurately represent our people and our history and our communities aren't being told by outsiders. And so obviously this has implications for curriculum development and for what kids are learning in schools. And so, for many years we've understood and we've seen that our kids aren't seeing themselves reflected in their curriculum and in their studies and what they're learning in schools. So the council, the NunatuKavut Community Council, committed funds last year as the pilot program, committed its own sourced revenue to pilot this program in 7 of our schools on the southeast coast, and to work with the schools and the communities to ensure that kids and youth are involved in programming and activities and curriculum that reflects who they are and where they come from and where they continue to belong. Success in this context is measured in various ways. I think we see success when we here at NCC recognize that we have diverse communities along our coast, and we recognize that all of our communities play a role in deciding what education should look like for our kids. So historically, community members and communities played a very active role in the education of our children, whether that be teaching kids how to navigate the land, fishing, hunting, harvesting, making clothing. All of these things have been significant and important, and this program has really evolved from a place that has listened to what people in our communities continue to say and their concerns about kids growing up not being equipped, for example, to navigate the land, to be able to drive skidoo when they go out hunting on skidoo, for example, or a boat, and being able to appreciate harsh climates and weather patterns, and so in a large way, what's been super successful about this is that we work with every community and every school individually for them to determine what aspects of traditional education they want to focus on this school year. And so Some or all schools, for example, may choose to build komatiks or make snowshoes. Some schools are more focused on, preserving traditional cooking and preserving foods and different initiatives like that. But our success really is measured in the way that youth, schools, and communities have been embracing this program, and how excited schools have been to participate, and communities, and the way in which we ensure that community members become teachers in this process. So, for example, if we offer snowshoe making at one of the schools, it's not the local teacher necessarily that's teaching that. We bring in someone from that community who can pass down that knowledge to the children, and they work with the teacher and the schools to make that happen. So that's really important. So for us, I guess success is measured in making sure that not only that our children see themselves reflected in the curriculum and in the programming and in the activities that they're doing, but that we encourage and engage our community members so that our youth continue to be educated in ways that are more reflective of our values and our society and the way of our culture and our people. Indigenous education is about, at least from my perspective and from what I'm learning and working with so many of our communities through this process and through other processes, is that education is about us, our people, and our communities telling our own stories and identifying what aspects, what aspects of who we are and how we live that we want to reinforce within our school system, and how we want to incorporate that, and how we want to make sure that kids are immersed in culturally relevant programming. So Indigenous education in that sense is really about respecting the autonomy of our communities as teachers and leaders and the real knowledge holders, as equal and equitable participants in the education of our children and of our youth. So it's really, to have a successful Indigenous education program means that we really have to take direction from our communities, and that they become the lead, as they've always have been in educating our kids. I guess it's important to recognize that Indigenous is a way, I guess, for us to identify in a way that's almost collegial, and then you can relate with other Indigenous peoples and become part of Indigenous discussions related to education. That's one thing. But I think for Indigenous people and for Southern Inuit and certainly for me and for the people that I talk to in our communities, Indigenous may be a term that some use or some do not, but who you are is really about, it's not easy to sum up in a term or a label, because who you are is expressed through your relationship with the land and where you come from and where you belong and how you continue to live on that land and that water and that ice, and why that still continues to be important to you. So I find when I talk to a lot of people in our communities, and you have conversations outside of this but are certainly a part of this type of discussion, that people spend a lot of time privileging and talking about who they are in relation to the land that they live on, and in relation to the land that they know, and the land of their ancestors. So right now, what we're working on in our communities is this program right now. We're hoping, and we're working, taking steps to have this program inform a core credit course that will be offered in our schools on the southeast coast. So this program also has a research element to it, where we are evaluating the program and taking the knowledge, not taking knowledge, but certainly embracing and the knowledge of communities and schools right now, and working with them to inform what an accurate and reflective core course about, that reflects our history and our culture and our communities could look like. So that's something we're working towards on our end. I mean, on a larger scale, ideally, I think, on a larger scale, I still think, from a community context, I think that Indigenous communities, Indigenous people themselves, have to be the ones that decide what narratives and what types of knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, are being perpetuated about them throughout our school systems and throughout education. We have to be a part of the writing, the co-writing, the authorization, the consent of what this looks like. I mean, I think time is long gone where we open up a social studies textbook and realize that most of what's written is completely inaccurate and reflects Eurocentric ways of being and knowledge that can't really be translated in a classroom. One, because you don't have an Indigenous person teaching it or someone from our respective communities teaching it, and two, because people are writing from ways of being and knowing that are alien and foreign to our own communities and to our own culture, so you're not going to get that right in this process. Or in a lot of times what I see, history and culture is not reflected at all, and I mean, that's when I see that, I see the erasure of an entire Indigenous people and community. So that's problematic. And so what has to happen there, I think, is institutions have to understand and be open and willing to the idea that we can't write other people's stories for them, and we can't be a part of someone else's truth telling, and that has to come from communities themselves. So finding ways to work with communities, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous governments and organizations to ensure that happens into the future is a big first step. It's great to have all these grand ideas of what Indigenous education could look like into the future and in this country, but the reality is you have to assume zero knowledge when you're working with institutions in this regard. It seems to be a process to get to a place where there's a mutual understanding. Just a simple, from our perspective, what would be a simplistic understanding of, you can't tell our story, just like we can't tell someone else's or another Indigenous community's story. We have our own processes of consent and of informing narrative and ideas within our communities that we respect and that we have to go through when we do this work ourselves. And that seems to be a basic first step that has to be realized, I guess, amongst various institutions and governments. I needed people within institutions to work on their ability to get to a place of understanding that doesn't require us to continuously educate and try to drive home the importance of some of these, what we consider to be basic ideas of working together collaboratively to achieve an end, whether that is, an education system and structure that really respects and fosters an atmosphere and an environment of growth and progression and mutual understanding. It's really about people taking the onus to understand and to really become a part of the solution, and that involves educating yourself. Because a lot of times we find ourselves having to do so much awareness, ground level awareness and educating outside of our communities. It takes up a lot of time. I can just give you an example right now. You scroll through a website and you find something on heritage, on our provincial Newfoundland heritage website that purports to tell a story about who our people are, who Southern Inuit are. And it's written by not one of our people, and there was no discussion with us in the write-up of this. And so it's taking, instead of someone or myself just being able to say, hey, we need to write this, or we need to be involved in the consent process and the co-writing because it's inaccurate and it doesn't reflect our way of thinking. And then someone just understand that, it's this big correspondence back and forth that has to happen because people don't get that. People are not really getting that you cannot be the author of someone else's story, and that the autonomy rests with the Indigenous peoples themselves.
Absolutely.
So that's certainly that's certainly something that can be done. And I mean, there's so many things, right? When you think about, on a provincial level, when I think about sort of the state of curriculum in our province, and I mean, my daughter is in grade 7, so I've seen, a fair amount. And I recognize that the Indigenous content is marginalized, and when it does exist, it's there in a way that it's not there in a way that teaches about a history of colonization and oppression, and then with an equal focus on the resilience and resurgence of Indigenous peoples and their right to their place and their culture. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but again, there's lots that Indigenous peoples can do to assist with making great changes in that. But the first step really is and the onus is on the part of institutions and governments to educate themselves and take the initiative to become aware, to learn, to understand, and be prepared to engage with us from that level. Otherwise, we're just exhausting ourselves, spending so much time, resources, and capacity, oftentimes which we don't even have, just to educate and to bring awareness. And sometimes there's a lot of struggles in doing that. So I think that's something that can be done, that I often see as something that's outside of our jurisdiction. We don't depend on other resources and other peoples to teach us how to think or to be. We do a lot of work internally to make sure that we have the capacity, the resources, the skills, and the knowledge to engage with external organizations and our partners, and to come to the table at a place of a level playing field of understanding. I guess it's great that there's a focus from a national perspective on Indigenous education. Certainly we know that when Indigenous people see themselves reflected in the curriculum and in the stories, and positively reflected in the curriculum and in the stories, that they become more immersed in and invested in education, and it's an important way forward, I think. Education can be, and has been, a very powerful tool in creating a knowledge base in this country. And I think the only way that we're going to achieve anything in the realm of reconciliation in this context is through recognizing, recognizing that there are principles of self-determination that are important to Indigenous peoples in doing this work, and that the autonomy rests with them and us in order to achieve that, working collaboratively, of course.